Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator, very successful author of The Madness of Crowds, among others. Good morning to you, Douglas.
Good morning. Very good to be with you, Julia.
Let me just start with a very open question. What do you make of both the protests that have been taking place and the police and government reaction to them?
Well, the protests themselves, they're clearly now completely divorced from the original issue. Almost everybody I can think of, everyone I've ever heard from, is united in being horrified by the manner in which George Floyd was killed by the policeman who detained him. But the death of one man in Minnesota at the hands of one policeman is not a reason for people to, in their thousands, turn out cities across the world, as it happens now, certainly across all of Europe, across Brussels, Stockholm, London, Glasgow, to turn out in their thousands repeatedly, day after day, and do several things. The first is to completely break the lockdown that the rest of the country has been told it's so vital for us to be in. We've decided as a society, the police has decided, the governments have decided, that there's one thing more important than the coronavirus. There's one thing even more important than stopping the spread of the coronavirus. And that's anyone who just says they want to turn out, whether they mean it or not, to protest in this manner. And the second thing is that we are seeing in this what the things in our society are that we are really fearful of. If these protests had been, for instance, opposed to the lockdown protests, they would not have gone ahead. There would have been arrests. They would have been.
But we saw that with the protests in Hyde Park that did take place.
And what's more, let's remember what the media would do in this situation. The media in these situations would be condemning people for daring to put the public health at risk. We'd be hearing from journalists about how selfish all these people are. But when it comes to this one, because the protesters are able to say it's under the guise of Black Lives Matter, and I think, as I say, that's gone to the background now, and this is about other things, they can say it's about Black Lives Matter, and so everybody's shut up because so many people have been persuaded of this stupid idea that if something says it's called Black Lives Matter, that's what it is, and you can't criticize it, and you can't object to it. And that is the reason.
But the interesting thing is, you say
in the position they are in.
But you say that
the
people have to
blackmailed and gagged like the rest of British society and so many other societies, and they are gagged into thinking that if they acted forcefully or in any way, on the front foot, people would say, "Aha, this is a further demonstration of police racism, and it means that it's happening in the UK." And so I don't envy the police. They've been stuck to a great degree by the wider societal pusillanimity when it comes to a group that turns from having a righteous cause into being a thuggish and extremely troubling demonstration day after day.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there. The vagaries of talking in different rooms with different phone signals and the like. You mentioned at one point that the police are being gagged and everyone has to shut up and not speak out. It's almost worse than that. If you don't speak out, and I've seen this all over social media, people saying, "Why haven't you condemned this? Why has this politician or this particular corporation or anybody not condemned what happened to George Floyd? Why have you not spoken out in favour of Black Lives Matter?" And if you don't speak out and say the exact correct words at the correct time, you yourself must be a racist.
Yes, this is the latest move in this intimidatory movement. Then the move is to say, among other things, that silence is violence. And if you don't spend all your time talking about the manner in which the Minnesota police force should act, you are demonstrating that you actually approve of the killing of people, specifically of the killing of black people. It's a horrible smear, a very, very ugly innuendo, about the most ugly you could do. And it's being used simply to push forward a set of ideological claims being made by extremely ideological people. And what they're trying to do, they are, among other things, for instance, saying silence is violence. These are, by the way, the same people who spent recent years saying that words are violence, that if you don't use the correct words and you use certain words, those words are violent. And simultaneously, actual violence isn't violence. So silence is violence, words are violence, but violence isn't violence, it's something else. It's, what is it? Effusive action or something like this. Maybe particularly strong expression of one's feelings. Well, sorry, No, as a society, we have very clear limits on these things. You may feel very strongly about all sorts of things. I do, you do, we all do. But we know, among other things, that there are things that stand above that. In the COVID era, we have, in the main, believed that actually standing much more important above our personal views and feelings is the greater public good. We also recognize that there are all sorts of things that annoy us and offend us and sometimes grieve us greatly. But it doesn't mean that we can go and beat up British policemen. It doesn't mean that we can rampage through the streets. It doesn't mean that we just tear down whatever we want to tear down. We know that.
And yet the rules seem to be different. What did you make about, talking of the tearing down of the tearing down of the statue to Edward Colston? He was, of course, a Bristol slave trader. He made huge amounts of money. He later the statue, by all accounts, it was given for his was put up because of recognising his philanthropy. Huge amounts of money given. A large part of Bristol built with his money. Of course, money made through the selling of black slaves and the American slave trade. But the taking down of his statue, a statue to someone, who acted in the 17th century at a time when this was normalised behaviour, but also the defacing of the Winston Churchill statue with the words "is a racist." What did you make of both of those events?
Yes, and much more. I mean, on Wednesday last week, Earl Haig's statue defaced on Whitehall, and the cenotaph defaced. These are. I mean, the problem is that there are people who excuse one of these, and then in the end, you're on this famously slippery slope where you basically have to tolerate all of it. And I think it's all intolerable. I don't think that crowds and mobs do have the right to pull down things that they claim to be outraged by. And by the way, I don't think they are outraged, particularly by this statue in Bristol. The statue was put up because clearly the city was paying homage to the philanthropy of the man in question. Now, statues are a notoriously tricky issue. They are in every country because they tell you things about your past. But there is a misunderstanding, among other things, that the mob that operated yesterday in Bristol had. People seem to actually think that in some way this statue was there because of celebrating the slave trade or emulating it or worshipping it in some way. Now, the scenes themselves were reminiscent of somewhere in the Middle East or something, where after a revolution, and where everybody's passions just go wild. I mean, the mob jumping on the statue of Edward Colston and jumping up and down it was this deranged behavior. I mean, this was a deranged mob. And there are people, of course, who, again, want to push their own political agenda through and say, oh, if you're critical of the pulling down of the statue, it must mean you're pro-slavery. I mean, please. How simplistic these people want to make our world. The fact is that some of us are very worried about it because we know from history, one of the important things about studying history, what happens when mobs go around operating like this. And it's exactly what has been happening in London and elsewhere. It's been happening in Brussels, it's happened in Stockholm, which is that people become more and more emboldened about what they're allowed to do by a society and a police force that's become cowed by them. Particularly young people, particularly young men throughout history have this. They test what the limits of violence are. They test what their elders are going to allow them to get away with. And once they've got away with one thing, they try to get away with the next. And there seems to me to be no quarter to give on this, because there are very interesting and important discussions to happen about our past, but they're not this one-directional mob behavior to tell us what our past was. And the worst way in which you can have an actually meaningful discussion about that is for a group of people to act like thugs and start smashing things and start attacking policemen. And also then for the media in this country to be so cowed, not everywhere, but so significantly cowed that people in the media even are fearful of saying, no, this is mob behavior. This is thug behavior. We don't tolerate it on any issue.
And that's the issue, because we do tolerate it on certain issues. As you say, if you speak out about it, then frankly the mob will come for you. But again, just finally and briefly on the issue of tearing down statues, defacing statues, and criticising everything in our past, the reality is, we've never lived. I mean, this is almost the irony. We've never lived in a better time. It's never been a better time to be alive, whoever you are, let alone if you are young and black, or if you're a woman, or if you're gay, or if you're trans, or anything. There has never been a better time to be alive in terms of our freedom, freedoms and our economic prosperity, even during the lockdown, during a pandemic. And yet, when we try and sort of impose the values and the belief systems that we have now and the laws we have now on our past, whether it's back to 1940s or to the 17th century, we make a mockery of our history. You cannot judge the people of the past, certainly not centuries ago, based on our social and moral values now.
No, these people are trying to, and they're doing so in a manner of incredible hostility to our country. It's not looking at us and looking for a fair estimation of our past. It's an incredibly hostile attack on our past. It's a hostile pretense of interrogation of our past. And the great irony of it, as you just put your finger on it, is that they do so in the countries that are most free and most desirable to live in, because they're the most tolerant. And what has happened in this era, and this may well have been exacerbated by the lockdown, is that we see the morbidities that exist in a society. And one of the morbidities in British society is this pretense that we are this fantastically racist, terrible country, when in fact the people who say that have got away with saying it without enough opposition for too long. And the result is that you see wounded policemen on the streets who have nothing to do with Minnesota policing, who are being attacked and assaulted, and our monuments attacked and pulled down, and Winston Churchill's statue defaced, all because so many people for such a long time have allowed people to just get away with lying about this country's past and lying about its present.
Okay. Douglas Murray, always a pleasure to speak to you. I'm sure people are cheering right now listening to the radio. Associate Editor of The Spectator, author, of course, of the best-selling Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds. Thank you so much for joining us.